Hello students, and welcome to lecture 5. This lecture is going to be on the integument or the integumentary system, which is a fancy word meaning the skin. Right, so this lecture is about the skin, the integument, and the integument is actually considered to be an organ, believe it or not. It's considered to be an organ system. And as we said earlier in the introductory lecture, the integument is considered to be the skin, the fingernails, the toenails, and the hair, basically. Sometimes the whites of the eyes, which are called the conjunctiva, are also classified as part of the integument. But anyway, we'll just mainly be discussing the skin. Okay, so I'm going to start out by discussing the layers of the skin. So the skin is divided up into 3 general layers. The very top layer is called the epidermis. Epi, as I explained before, the word epi means above or on top of, right? So when we discussed the histology in histology lecture, we discussed the fact that epithelial tissue, epithelium, is a layer of tissue that you find on top of all the other tissues, and then it contains the word epi, meaning above or on top of. Okay, so the epidermis is the top layer of skin. Then we have the dermis, and then you're probably familiar with the word hypo. The word hypo means less than or underneath. So the hypodermis is the area underneath the dermis. Okay, so the 3 layers of skin, starting from the outside going inward: epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. The dermis contains the hair follicles and the sweat glands, right? And so the dermal layer contains that. The epidermis contains mainly just the skin cells as we know them. Right. Now, once we start talking about glands, sweat glands, and another type of gland, other types of glands like the eccrine glands and things, we'll be talking about glands that are present inside the dermal layer, inside the dermis. Okay, so we're going to talk about a set of glands called the sudoriferous glands, which includes the sweat glands, apricot glands, and eccrine glands. We'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about the sebaceous glands. The sebaceous glands are every hair that either comes out of your head or comes out of your skin is associated with a gland called a sebaceous gland. And sorry about the misspelling there, but the sebaceous glands produce a fluid called sebum, and sebum is an oil. Right, so I had written oil there. Right, so when your hair gets oily, it's because the sebaceous glands are producing an oil called sebum that is coating the hair, and then when you wash your hair, you wash the sebum oil off of it. All right, now another interesting thing about the skin is that it is responsible, being an organ, it is responsible for the synthesis of vitamin D, and you'll learn later on that we need vitamin D in order to absorb calcium from our food. So there's kind of an interesting thing about the skin and the production of vitamin C. Okay, now you know what a precursor is. The word precursor refers to starting materials. So starting materials that are not complete, right? So boards are precursors to a house. They're not a house yet, but if somebody builds them, organizes them into a house, then you've got a house. Okay, so the human body builds a precursor to vitamin D, and that precursor is converted into vitamin D, into active vitamin D in the skin by sunlight. So in order to be perfectly healthy, we need a certain amount of sunlight. We need a certain amount of sunlight. You can take vitamin D pills, but it's just as easy to get some sunlight. So you do need sunlight. Now there's an interesting kind of balance that the human body achieves between sunlight and cancer. So if you don't have enough sunlight, then you don't get enough vitamin D. If you're exposed to too much sunlight, the odds become greater that you may develop skin cancer, because ultraviolet light from the sun damages the DNA that's present in the epidermal layer of the skin. And if you have damaged DNA, damaging the DNA can sometimes lead to cancer. So, in order to prevent that, the skin has a type of cell in it called a melanocyte that produces a brown pigment called melanin. And so melanin is the word pigment means a coloration, or something that has a color, right? So the melanocytes produce a brown pigment called melanin, and that protects us, or that gives the skin a certain amount of protection from skin cancer. So if you're living in an area that has a lot of sunlight, a lot of direct sunlight near the equator or the tropics, you're in direct sunlight a lot of the time, it stands to reason that your skin should have a lot of melanin in it to protect you from skin cancer. On the other hand, if you live way to the north or way to the south and you don't get a lot of direct sunlight, the risk of having skin cancer is less, but the melanin actually interferes with sunlight getting to the skin and producing vitamin D. So in that case, you might, as a trade-off, get rid of some of the melanin in order to make better use of the sunlight in your skin to make vitamin D, right? So it's kind of an interesting trade-off that the human race has made between melanin in the skin and the amount of sunlight that you are exposed to. So as it happens, if you have dark skin that has lots of melanin, you are better protected from skin cancer than if you have lighter skin, fair skin. On the other hand, if you have darker skin, your skin is less efficient at converting the sunlight into vitamin D, but that doesn't matter because you get enough sun to compensate for that, basically. But if you're a person who has dark skin and you move away from the sun, like to the far north or to the far south, then you should take vitamin D supplements, because the sunlight is not giving you enough vitamin D in the far north or the far south. Right, so that's a trade-off that we have made between sunlight and vitamin D versus skin cancer. Right. Okay, now what if the skin is damaged? So as I said in this course, we're gonna learn about, for every organ system that we study, we're gonna learn a little bit about pathologies, or things that cause damage to the various organ systems that we're talking about. In the case of the skin, one of the worst things, obviously, that can happen to the skin is burns. And if you're a doctor or a nurse who's assessing how badly somebody was burned, you have a certain system for classifying burns, and those are first-degree burns, second-degree burns, third-degree burns, and fourth-degree burns. So we will learn how to classify burns. And furthermore, we're going to learn about something called the rule of nines, which is how you estimate what percentage of the skin surface has been burned based on where the burns are and how big they are. All right, and then if you have damage to the skin, burns or other things, we'll talk about the healing of the skin. Healing is technically called a regeneration. Now, if you have, let's say you have a minor burn like a sunburn, that's often called a first-degree burn. If you have a minor burn like a sunburn, it will usually heal completely, and you've had a sunburn, it turns red, the skin turns red, it peels off. What's happening when it peels is that the cells on the outer surface of the skin have had their DNA damaged by the ultraviolet light, and then rather than risk forming cancers, those cells actually, basically, they commit suicide. That's something called apoptosis. So apoptosis is where a cell deliberately dies, and one of the reasons why cells deliberately commit suicide, they deliberately die, is because their DNA has been damaged, often by ultraviolet radiation, and they're worried. I mean, I don't think they think, but this is what happens. There is a danger that if you have your DNA damaged, that there could be damage to some of the genes that control the cell cycle and determine when the cells should or shouldn't be dividing, and that would lead to cancer. So it's better for the cell to just die and then fall off and then be replaced by a new cell that doesn't have damaged DNA. So that's what happens when you have a bad sunburn. It turns red, it peels, it falls off, the top layer falls off, and then the skin returns and completely heals so that you can never tell there was any damage. That is called complete regeneration. Now, if it doesn't completely heal, you have a scar, and that is so if you cut your skin, and it's a nice clean cut and it doesn't get infected, and then you do something to put the ends back together, it will not form a scar. And in fact, when you have surgeons doing plastic surgery, they deliberately cut the skin with very sharp knives to make sure that you have a good clean cut, and then after they're finished, they they seal the edges back together perfectly, so there's no mismatch, and ideally and hopefully it will not form a permanent scar. It usually does form a scar at first, but eventually that scar goes away, and then you have perfect skin. You go back to having perfect skin where the skin was damaged at one point by an incision, a surgical incision. So sometimes the skin will heal perfectly, but you know that sometimes if you have badly damaged skin, it will heal and it will form a scar. Now, regular skin is made of epithelial cells that are close together. They're held together very closely. Whereas scar tissue contains a few cells, but it contains mostly connective tissue. It contains mostly fibrous connective tissue and a few cells that are producing the fibrous connective tissue, right? So, and that is a scar, and that looks somewhat different than regular skin. Okay, so there's some parts of the body that will regenerate if you damage them, and there's some parts of the body that will not regenerate, that will never regenerate. Heart muscle, cardiac muscle is an example of a tissue that will never regenerate, for example. All right, and then we will, at the end, we'll talk about different forms of skin cancer and how we classify them. We'll talk about some other skin conditions. So basically, we will discuss some pathologies of the integument. Okay, so as we said, the upper layer of skin is called the epidermis, right? And the epidermis actually has several layers of tissue that all have different names, and we're not going to go into those. But if you were a histologist or a pathologist, you would have to know the names of all of the layers, different layers of the epidermis. Now, the epidermis is made of several layers of squamous epithelium. So it's stratified squamous epithelium, and in the cells that are close to the top, you have keratinization, which means that as these cells, as the cells, dead cells will flake off of the surface, they will kind of come off of the surface of your skin, and they will be replaced by new cells moving up in the skin layer to take their place. And as they move closer to the surface, those cells, those squamous epithelial cells that are forming the top layer of the skin, as they move closer to the surface, they start to fill up with a protein called keratin, until eventually they die, and then the keratin, you just have these dead cells on the surface that are filled up with keratin. That process is called keratinization. And the purpose of keratin is it's a very hydrophobic protein. So one of the main purposes of the skin, and one of the main reasons why the skin is filled with keratin, is to make sure that it's watertight, so that to a certain extent it prevents a lot of water from getting into the body, but more importantly it prevents water from seeping out of the body and causing dehydration. So the main purpose of having a watertight hydrophobic layer of protein on the outside of the body is to prevent water loss. Okay, underneath the epidermis we have the dermis, which contains the blood vessels as well as some sensory nerves. You know that if you touch your skin, you can feel pressure. That's due to sensory nerves that sense pressure. There are other sensory nerves that sense heat and other sensory nerves that sense pain. We have all of those in our dermal layer. The roots of hairs, which are referred to as hair follicles. So, you know, when you say you pull a hair out by the root is actually a structure called a follicle. Right? And then we have glands. So the glands that you find in the dermal layer include apocrine glands, eccrine glands, and sebaceous glands. Okay, now underneath the dermal layer, we have something called the hypodermis, which is also known as the subcutaneous fascia. The word fascia is a Latin word for face. The word cutaneous refers to the skin, and therefore subcutaneous means just under the skin. The subcutaneous fascia is made of subcutaneous fat. Right? So adipose cells, adipose tissue just under the cutaneous layer, underneath the subcutaneous fat. Okay, so here's a diagram. So up here we have the epidermis, this layer that kind of goes like this, right? So that is all this kind of bumpy layer here. this whole thing, this area, is the epidermis. And as I said, it's divided up into different layers. The top layer is called the stratum corneum. The next layer is called the stratum lucidium, the stratum granulosum, the stratum spinosum, and the stratum basale. For this course, we don't need to memorize those terms. We do not need to memorize those names. But if you were a histologist, you'd have to. Okay, then underneath the epidermis, you can see here we have the dermis, all of this, and you see blood vessels, you see hair follicles, you see sebaceous glands, you see nerves. And then underneath that you have the subcutaneous fascia, or the hypodermis, which is made of mainly just fat tissue, called subcutaneous fat or subcutaneous adipose tissue. As we said, the word epi means above. It is made of stratified squamous epithelium. The cells are created through cell division at the bottom level of this layer. They're born at the lowest level. They're kind of round when they're born, but as they move up towards the top, they flatten out in order to become perfect squamous cells, and they fill up with keratin, with a hydrophobic protein called keratin, and that protein is called keratinization. Right, so keratinization is hard, strong, and hydrophobic. It makes the skin watertight, and so the hair it avoids water loss. It prevents you from losing water to the environment and getting dehydrated. It also contains the melanocytes, which I mentioned. So the melanocytes produce a pigment. The word pigment means a coloration, something colored. You know, paints are sometimes referred to as pigments. And then that pigment, a brown pigment, is called melanin. Melanin makes the skin darker, and it also protects us to a certain extent. It protects the skin from skin cancer, from sun damage. Right? Okay, so the cells are then attached at the bottom to something called a basement membrane. So we're still in the epidermis here. At the bottom layer of epidermis, we have something called a basement membrane. So there's a little tiny layer of loose connective tissue in between the epidermis and the dermis. And so remember that epithelial cells, as we said in the last lecture, epithelial cells have an apical surface, which is the top, and they have a basal surface, which is the bottom. Okay, so here's basically there's this curly thing here represents the basal layer of the epithelium. So that area right there and above is the epithelium. Hey, here's a histology photo, a cross-section through skin. So you can see that these cells are flat. This is stratified squamous epithelium. And you see these flakes that are coming off at the top. That's a telltale sign that we're looking at skin, and that is an example of keratinization. The epidermis contains the melanocytes that produce melanin, which if you go out into the sun, the melanocytes get more active and produce more melanin to try and give your sun some protection, or to try and give your skin some protection from the sun. As you can tell, different people who originally come from different parts of the world have different levels, have a different base level of melanin production. So some people, even if they stay out of the sun, their skin is fairly dark, and then those people have a higher level of melanin production. Whereas some people, if they're out of the sun, they are extremely fair, which means that in the absence of sun, their skin produces very little melanin. Okay, the dermal layer, right? So it has more connective tissues and more blood cells. It has blood vessels, a type of blood vessel called capillaries. In the face, we have a bunch of capillary blood vessels that make us blush. If your skin is fair enough to see when somebody blushes, that's quite an interesting phenomenon. It contains sensory neurons that can sense pain and heat and so on, and it contains the hair follicles. Each hair follicle, the root of a hair is called the follicle. If you're interested in forensics and police work, if you want to get DNA, sometimes you see detectives looking around for hairs for suspects. And if you just find a hair, that's of no use to you because hair doesn't contain any DNA. It's just made of a protein called keratin. If you find a fingernail, that doesn't contain any DNA. But if you find a hair that has a root that has the follicle still attached to it, that is living tissue made of cells, and it will have DNA. So you can take a DNA fingerprint from a hair that has the root attached to it. All right, so each one of those hairs is associated, the hair follicle also contains a structure called an erector pili muscle. The word pili is the plural of pilus, P-I-L-U-S, and a pilus is the Latin word for a spear. Right, so a lot of words in anatomy come from ancient Latin words or ancient Greek words. So the word pilus is a Latin word meaning a spear that you would throw at somebody. So the purpose of this muscle, the erector pili muscle, is to cause the hair to stand up. Right? So when you get cold and the hairs on your arms stand up because you're cold, that's because the erector pili muscles are pulling the hair straight up, which makes it easier for warm air to get trapped inside the hair. Obviously the same, it doesn't do us much good because we don't have much hair, but it does a lot of good for furry animals. So that furry animals, every hair has an erector pili muscle that pulls the hair up in the cold, and then that allows their fur to trap more warm air. Okay, sebaceous glands. There's a sebaceous gland associated with each hair follicle that produces an oil called sebum. Right? And then we also have a type of gland. So those are the sebaceous glands that are associated with the hairs, and we also have eccrine glands that basically they produce sweat, right? And they are sudoriferous, also known as sudoriferous glands. They produce sweat. Sweat is mainly just saline. So saline is just water, sodium chloride, potassium chloride, and in the case of human sweat, there are sometimes a few other proteins in there, but it's mostly just a saline solution. Okay, then we have apocrine glands, which are also a form of sudoriferous gland, but these are special sweat glands that you find around the groin and the armpits. Right, now you notice that the groin and the armpits are more odoriferous than regular sweat glands, right? So if they're going to stink, they smell bad. In fact, they deliberately produce odors. The sudoriferous glands deliberately produce odors and pheromones. Pheromones are chemicals that are meant to, in this case, are meant to attract a mate. That's a whole other issue. We can talk about that another time, but yes, animals attract each other by smells, and those smells are usually produced by the apocrine glands. Okay, so here we see sweat glands. There's a sweat gland, right? There's a sudoriferous, there's a sebaceous gland rather, that is at the base of this hair follicle. There's the erector pili, and then we have some neurons and so on. Okay, the word hypo means underneath, and so that's where the term hypodermic needle comes from. It means that you have a needle that is meant to be inserted all the way through the skin underneath to the subcutaneous fascia. So a hypodermic needle goes hypo, under the skin, hypodermic. Okay, so the hypodermis is also known as the subcutaneous fascia. The word cutaneous means the skin. The hypodermis is a subcutaneous layer underneath the skin. It's mainly adipose tissue or subcutaneous fat. Now, I mentioned earlier what a laceration is. I mentioned that in the histology lecture. A laceration is where you have an injury. Let's say you're in an automobile accident and you're bounced around in the car in such a way that your skin moves in one direction and the underlying muscle tissue moves in the other direction, and so there's this lateral tear between the skin and the muscle, but it does not break the skin. That's called a laceration. And so usually what's happening is, in a laceration, there's a tear between either the dermal layer and the subcutaneous fat, or there's a tear between the subcutaneous fat and the muscle tissue underneath it. Okay, so a tear in there somewhere perhaps. And a hypodermic needle is meant to go under the skin. It's meant to go under the dermis, all the way through the dermis to the layer of subcutaneous fat. All right, so vitamin D is needed in order to absorb calcium in the intestines. The body produces an inactive precursor of vitamin D. There's the word precursor. That is converted to the active form of vitamin D by sunlight. Right, so vitamin D is converted into inactive vitamin D is converted into active vitamin D in the epidermis while in the sunlight. We need a certain amount of sunlight to get healthy bones, because we need a certain amount of sunlight to get the proper amount of vitamin D. Otherwise, you could grow up. The worst thing that happens to people who don't get enough calcium in their diet is they get a disease called rickets, which is weakening of the bones, which is caused by a lack of calcium to put in the bones. Okay, so why do you have a lack of calcium? You might have lots of calcium in your diet, but if you don't have enough vitamin D, your intestines can't absorb that calcium. Right? So your intestines need to be able to absorb the calcium, or it's no use to you. So you need to have vitamin D to absorb it. Now, as I said, if you have a lot of pigment in your skin, that does a better job of protecting your skin from skin cancer if you're in bright sunlight. But if you've moved or you live in an area where there's not a lot of direct sunlight, and you have dark skin, you should definitely take vitamin D pills, because the melanin interferes with the sunlight, creating enough vitamin D for your body to function properly. So if you have a darker skin pigment naturally and you live in an area that doesn't get much sunlight, like Canada, for instance, doesn't get much sunlight, you should probably take vitamin D supplements, vitamin D pills. Okay, now let's talk about what happens when the skin is damaged. Let's talk about some skin pathology. So burns are classified as first, second, third, and fourth degree burns. And then in addition to that, you usually determine how much of the body has first degree burns versus second degree burns by applying something called the rule of nines. All right, so here, notice how much these figures show us approximately what percentage of the skin is contained in different parts of the body. All right, so the front of your leg contains about 9% of the skin, and the back of the leg contains about 9%. And the front of each arm is about 4.5%, so that means each arm altogether is about 9%. The abdomen is 9%, the thorax is 9%, and then 9% on the back for each of those areas. And then the entire head is about 9%. Right? So if you take each leg is 18, front and back. Right? So 18 plus 18 plus 9 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 adds up to 99%. So we haven't this rule is not perfect, but that's the rule of nines. Right? So that's for an adult. The difference between an adult and a child is that the head takes up more of the total. Right? So this area, the whole front part of the trunk takes up 18, which is the same. 18, each leg is a little bit less, but the head takes up 18 rather than 9. And then on a baby, the head takes up even more. So there's a difference between applying the rule of nines to an adult versus a child versus a baby. Okay, so I would never ask you on a test about a child or a baby in this case, but you should learn a little bit you should try and memorize the rule of nines. In case I ask you a question about on an exam, I might say something like, well, if a man goes out into the sunlight with no hat and no shirt, he gets a bad sunburn on his arms, his front, his back, and his head. What percentage of his skin has been sunburned? You would be able to calculate that using the rule of nines, right? So I might ask you something like that on a test. All right, now how do we classify the burns themselves? A first degree burn is where you have damage to the epidermal layer only. So for example, a sunburn would be an example of a first degree burn. It's painful for 1 or 2 days, and then it completely heals, it completely regenerates, so there is no scarring. A second degree burn is where you have damage to the epidermis and the top layer of the dermis, and you get blistering often, and it heals in about 2 weeks, but you may have some scarring. Okay, a third degree burn is getting quite serious. It damages all 3 layers, the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. It causes scarring. There's no pain on the burn per se because it's burned through the nerves that cause you pain, but it certainly hurts in the area around the burn. So third degree burns definitely hurt, but it's not the actual burned area that's causing the pain, it's the areas around it. Another problem with a third-degree burn is that if you've damaged the skin that badly, and if a large portion of the skin is damaged that badly, you will lose water because water will seep out of the burn, and then you have to make sure that the person is hydrated. Somebody that has third-degree burns is given an IV with saline, normal saline, to keep hydrated, to keep water. And then and generally a third-degree burn never heals properly. You have extensive scarring. And then a fourth-degree burn is where all three layers are completely burned away and the burn penetrates all the way to the bone. And obviously that will never heal because there's no tissue, there's no underlying tissue to heal. Basically, the only thing you can do with a fourth-degree burn is to sew it shut. Cut away the burned area and then pull the two edges together and sew it shut. Okay, so here you see a first-degree burn just penetrates the epidermal layer, usually no scarring. Second-degree burn penetrates the epidermal layer and the top of the dermis. Third-degree burn goes all the way through the epidermal layer, the dermis, and then the hypodermis. So in the first case, we don't have a scar, minor scarring, extensive scarring. All right, so when wounds heal, the first thing that happens is you have a blood clot that forms to form a seal on the wound, and that blood clot will dry out and become what we call a scab. And that scab is kind of like a natural bandage. It's kind of like a natural sticking plaster that allows the tissue to start healing underneath it. And so it's not so then eventually the scab will fall away and the skin may be regenerated underneath it. Okay, so regeneration is a general term where damaged skin is replaced by exactly the same type of tissue, right? And scarring in general is where the damaged tissue is replaced by scar tissue. And scar tissue contains fewer cells and is mostly connective tissue. And the cells that are present are called fibroblasts. And fibroblasts are the cells that make connective tissue, right? So remember, I may ask you this on a test. A fibroblast is a cell that makes connective tissue. It produces a protein called collagen and another protein called elastin. And some of these tissues, scar tissues are, 90% scar tissue and 10% cells, 10% fibroblasts. All right, so first-degree burns will regenerate. Second-degree will mostly. Third and fourth degrees won't regenerate, and you'll have extensive scarring. So if you have tissue that won't regenerate, you have to do a graft, a skin graft. All right, so you've probably seen people that have been burned have to have their skin grafted. A graft is maybe some of you are familiar with a tree graft or a plant graft. That's where you take a plum tree and you cut it off, and then you take the top of a cherry tree and cut it off, and then you put the cherry tree on top of the stump for the plum tree. That's called a graft, and the two will grow together as if they were one at the beginning, right? And so a skin graft is the same. This is where you take a piece of skin from another part of the body and you put it onto the burn and hope that it seals up and replaces the scarred area that was lost. Right? So there are two types. There are actually two types, or there are several definitions for grafting. An autograft, auto means yourself. Auto means yourself. So this is where you take skin from another part of your own body and graft it on top of the burn and then hope that the skin from the other part of your body will replace it. A heterograft, which is also known as an allograft, is a skin from a donor. Okay, so normally, this is not a very pleasant subject, but a lot of medicine and anatomy and things is not pleasant at all. This is not a very pleasant subject, but usually the donor is deceased. The skin is taken from a cadaver. Right? So when one of the things you can think about is if you die, you can think about filling out an organ donor form in the event that you die, and then your organs can be donated to other people. And usually when they give you an organ donor card, they say you have a box that you can check that says I'll donate anything versus specified organs. You say I'll donate my eyes, my kidneys, my heart, my liver, but you didn't check the skin box, for instance. Now if they do take if you do say that they can take your skin, what they do is they take it off of your back so that you can have an open casket at the funeral, for example, so that it doesn't destroy the appearance of your corpse if they take the skin from the back, which is that's where they take it. Okay, so that is what would be a heterograft or an allograft, and you could, if you donated your skin in that way, you could save somebody from having a terrible disfiguring scar. All right, so now what types of tissues regenerate versus not regenerating? So skin, if the burn is not terribly bad, the skin will regenerate. So skin will regenerate. Brain tissue, neurons never regenerate, and heart muscle never regenerates, right? So that's why damage to the brain or to the spinal cord injuries are so bad, because neurons do not regenerate, right? So they're doing all kinds of research to try and figure out ways to make neurons regenerate so that people with spinal cord injuries can live a more normal life. But so far, nothing has succeeded in getting neurons to generate. And heart muscle never regenerates. There is one exception to neurons and heart muscle regenerating, and that is embryonic stem cell tissue, which we'll talk about later. But basically, when you have a developing blastula, a human blastula or a human embryo, if you take that developing embryo and you take cells from it, you can use those cells to repair damaged neurons or damaged heart cells. The use of embryonic tissue for that is controversial because that means killing a human embryo, and some people are passionately against doing that. But that is what you can do with that tissue. All right, let's look at some pathologies of the skin. Let's look at the minor problems. Okay, so one minor problem with the skin is acne. This is where the sebaceous glands clog with keratin, and then a bacteria may infect it, and then you get pus forming because white blood cells that like to kill and destroy and eat bacteria will flood to the area, and those cells that are called phagocytes, by the way, they will cause something called a pimple, acne. Athlete's foot is a minor skin problem that's caused by a fungal infection. Right? So there is a fungus that will eat the keratin in your skin if given half the chance. And so if you get some of that on the bottom of your foot and then you walk around in a locker room with the other athletes and you don't have any shoes on, you will deposit that fungus onto the floor. And then if somebody else walks on the same floor, that fungus will get stuck to the bottoms of their feet, to the soles of their feet, and they'll have athlete's foot. Right? Okay, now bed sores or pressure ulcers, this is something that you get if you lie in one position for too long. That causes ischemia. Ischemia means that you cut off the blood flow to a certain area of the body. So you should remember the word ischemia because we're going to learn it later. We're going to use it quite a bit in this course. Right? So the word ischemia means that you cut off the blood supply to a certain area. And so if you are sitting in the same position too long, or if you're lying in bed too long, you get ischemia of the tissue that you're lying on top of, and then it dies. Now this is not a problem for regular people, but it is a problem for people who are confined to a bed due to an injury or something. So you have to, if somebody can't move themselves, if they are unable to move for themselves, you have to move them. Otherwise, they'll get pressure ulcers or bed sores. Furthermore, you have to move a baby. Right? So when you have a baby that's laying in a cradle, you have to move the baby every hour or so to prevent it from either getting bed sores or to prevent it from like if the baby's skull is developing, and if you leave the baby on one side too long without turning it, it may develop a flat spot on its skull. Right? So that's another problem with you have to turn the baby. And people who are confined to wheelchairs because they have a spinal cord injury, for instance, often have to worry about pressure sores. Right. All right, now finally, dermatitis, eczema, and psoriasis are chronic inflammation of the skin, which causes the skin to be itchy and peeling. Inflammation means that some body tissue turns red and swells up and hurts and becomes itchy, and that's inflammation. And in this case, that's caused by your body's own immune system attacking your own skin. That's called an autoimmune disease, and we'll talk a lot about autoimmune diseases when we get to the immune system. All right, let's look at some more serious things, serious problems with the skin. So cancer, basically what it is, it's very simple to understand. We do a lot of research on cancer to try and figure out ways to prevent it or to cure it, but we don't really need to do any research on what causes it because we know it's very simple. Cancer happens when genes, whenever cell division is controlled, so when a cell, most cells in the human body are not dividing, and they usually don't divide unless they're told to divide by another cell. What a cancer cell is a cell that's dividing uncontrollably. It was not told to divide, but it just starts dividing and it never knows when to stop. This happens because one of the genes that controls cell division has been mutated so that the gene is turned on when it's supposed to be turned off. Simple, right? So anything that damages DNA is usually a carcinogen. A carcinogen is something that causes cancer, right? So any chemicals or any radiation or even sunlight, all of those things are carcinogens because they damage DNA. And if you're unlucky enough to have your DNA damaged, and if the DNA that's damaged is a gene that codes for a protein that controls cell division, then you could end up having cancer. So cancer, then if a cell becomes cancerous, we refer to that as transformation, right? And it presents as, a medical term means how, the medical term presents as means how does it show up? How does it make its presence known? And so that's a medical term that you need to be familiar with. All right, so we have cancers of the skin, different types, right? So a basal cell carcinoma is where you have transformation of one of the basal cells in the bottom layer of the epidermis, right? And it presents as a bump under the skin generally. So if you have a bump under your face or you feel a bump under the skin, that could be a basal cell carcinoma, right? Squamous cell carcinoma, as you probably guessed, is where you have a squamous cell at the top layer of the epidermis that's become transformed, and it presents as a lesion or a blister. Lesion is a fancy term for blister. It just means a break or an opening, a lesion. Okay, a melanoma, as you've probably guessed, melanoma is where you have a melanocyte transformed. A melanocyte becomes transformed. So in the top layer of the epidermis. Right, so it becomes transformed and it presents as a mole with an irregular boundary. Right, so a melanoma presents as a mole on the skin with an irregular boundary. Most moles have a round boundary, they're round, but if it's jagged, that could be a melanoma. Okay, so this was a fairly short lecture. I'm sad to say that they're not all this short, but this one was fairly short. So what we discussed were the layers of the skin, the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. We talked about the subcutaneous fascia, which is the other name for hypodermis. We talked about the different types of glands that you find in the skin. The sebaceous glands produce sebum, which puts the oil onto the hair. The sudoriferous glands, we have two types, the apocrine glands and the eccrine glands. Right, we have hair follicles. We talked about how vitamin D is activated in the skin by sunlight, and how the human body has struck a balance between how much melanin you want to produce in order to protect you from skin cancer versus how much vitamin D you need and how much sunlight you live in. Right. So as I mentioned, if you have darker skin naturally and you live in a far northern area or a far southern area that doesn't get much sunlight, you would want to take vitamin D pills. You want to take vitamin D supplements because you're probably not getting, there's not enough sunlight to activate the vitamin D in your skin. We learned how to classify burns, first, second, third, and fourth degree burns. We learned about regeneration versus scarring, and we learned about autograft versus allograft. Allograft being a sample of skin, for instance, from another person, usually a cadaver, a dead person, versus autograft, where they take a piece of your own skin and they just take it off of one part of your body and move it to another. We talked about minor skin disorders, including acne and eczema and athlete's foot. We talked about the different types of skin cancers. Okay, so now move on to the next lecture, which is about the bones and bones in general.